And social Darwinism is applying survival of the fittest to people and saying that certain people become powerful in society just because they are innately better. And that's where it starts to take a turn for the worse. Because now we taking this very kind of baseline generalized statement of animals, and then now we're taking that and then applying it to people. And this is how um like imperialism was justified. This is how racism is justified. This is how eugenics became justified. Social inequality becomes justified. Even to this day, there is a lot of layers of this social Darwinism that's still present in our society, and how we vote, how we decide leaders, how we decide laws. It's still innately there. Like a lot of the things that people say is just stereotypes. It comes from social Darwinism, and it comes from Charles Darwin making these blanket statements, and then some people in some think tank somewhere was like, "Ooh, how can we apply this to people so we can set up our hierarchies?" Because before this point, like racism started to get old a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, like people, like there was quite a few plantations that started to get burned. Nat Turner had a big part in that. You know what I'm saying? There started to be a lot of slave rebellions, and I think people really underestimate. Like that's why I start to get really upset when people are like, "Hey, yeah, how do we know slavery happened?" Because they Massa and them was getting knocked off, and they had to keep making new laws and codes to keep people in line. They wouldn't just suddenly start making new laws for Black people if there wasn't slave rebellions happening.
No.
Period. So there started to be more and more of this, and they're like, this Bible thing, this curated Bible ain't working as much. They starting to get the real copy, and people is reading and shit. Oh, how can we have people allowed to read and learn the truth, but also keep this hierarchy? Because once you learn the truth, you the hierarchy ain't gonna be able to keep itself no more. And so I talked about this because it just shows how political oppression of people is something that has been influenced even by this so-called scientific biological standpoint, even if that wasn't, because I'm not gonna put it past Charles Darwin to be a little racist. I'm just saying,
Nah.
I'm not saying that it was truly the intent of that theory of, survival of the fittest, and then all of these different layers of gender in it for that to be translated to people with eugenics and like, black people have smaller brains, and some like all of these different things they would just literally make up came from this foundation. And it's not something that was believed for most of human history. So it's just something to think about. So what do you think about that just initially?
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of great points there. I think the first thing that came to mind, I even wrote it down to bring it up, is like the idea of confirmation bias. Because when it came to Darwin studies and like looking at survival of the fittest, or where gender essentialism came up in his research and his studies, like when you think something is true, you're going to find research and data that proves you right. Like that's one of the cognitive biases. That's something that everybody does. Like you see it a lot in the social media age too, is like, oh, I think LeBron's trash. Let me find 10 tweets that prove LeBron is trash, when you're just ignoring all the other evidence that says otherwise.
Right.
And so when it comes to that with like social Darwinists and survival of the fittest and how that relates to some of the things you brought up, like eugenics and social inequality, I think that can easily come up where if you live in a society where Black people and other marginalized groups are at the bottom of society and are seen as lesser than human, it's really easy to say that, oh yeah, this makes sense. Like Darwin said this, I see this in day-to-day life. Like you don't see any Black people running for leadership positions. They're not smart enough. And it's like, yeah, you kind of set it up to where they couldn't. So
Right.
I don't think that they would be able to. Um, And just like how you mentioned, like how racism got old, but just how things evolve over time. A book that I wanted to bring up that's one of the more impactful books that I read in college, and I think that we should always have a natural nonsense reading list. But The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I think that's a
Yep.
great book that kind of highlights not necessarily those specific topics, but the idea of how these things evolve over time and how systems evolve to keep different oppressed people oppressed. Um, but yeah, it's just very interesting when you look at some of the dominant research, the dominant ideologies that are taught to students in school. Like when we were in middle school, elementary school, like you learned a lot about Charles Darwin, and it was just like, oh yeah, survival of the fittest. And it isn't until you like get exposed to more knowledge and more research and more books by non-white people or people who have opposing ideologies that you see where some of these things that were taught as youth can be seen as problematic or are problematic just in general, because that's where intersectionality comes in too, like just seeing where this plays a role when you look at different people's different societies. um so yeah, I think that's just what come to mind is just that confirmation bias aspect of it, and just how like some of these things that were taught at such a young age mean like they mean something. Like yes, like learning about survival of the fittest is important when you're studying like science and whatnot,
Right.
but just thinking deeper into it I think is really important.
Yeah, and that's that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I think sometimes, like, especially our society today, there's this apathy around politics because it feels like there's and I want to say there is a concerted effort by the powers that be to make people apathetic, but people tend to say, "Oh, well, that doesn't impact me," and it's like, "Oh no, it definitely does." It doesn't matter if you think it does or not. Like, politics impacts every single person's existence. Like, as shitty as it is, it's not something we can just like put our head in the sand on and be like, oh, it'll fix itself. Nah, like it definitely impacts people and impacts how our structures are set up. And it also shows that there's other options, but I'll get into that later. The next thing I want us to talk about is this fact that I